February 27th, 1942. Over the Channel. The Green Light. February 27th, 1942. RAF Thruxton, Hampshire. The Whitley transport's cabin is a rattling tube of cold metal and canvas straps, stinking of oil, wet wool, and cigarette smoke, crushed out too quickly. Boots thud against the ribbed floor as men shuffle shoulder to shoulder under full kit, faces darkened, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. Major John D. Frost stands braced near the fuselage, feeling every vibration through his knees, listening to the engine's steady thunder and the thin, nervous jokes that keep the fear from boiling over. This is C Company, 2nd Parachute Battalion, new, untested as a unit, about to become history in the most unforgiving way possible, by jumping into occupied France at night. Across from him, Flight Sergeant Charles Cox, RAF, not infantry, checks the straps on his container like a man guarding a crown jewel, because he isn't here to kill Germans or take ground. He's here to steal a machine, to bring home Hitler's eyes, key parts of a German Würzburg radar set that British scientists are desperate to examine. The plan is audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its timing. Parachute in under a bright moon, hit the clifftop site near Bruneval north of Le Havre, rip out the components before the garrison can smash them, then race down to a small cove where the Royal Navy will pluck them off the beach at dawn. Airborne assault, married to sea escape. One clean motion, no second act. The aircraft lurches as it climbs into a clear, brittle night, and when the coast of France finally rises as a darker smear beneath the moon, the mood in the cabin shifts. Talk dies, hands tighten on webbing, and you can hear the parachute packs creak as bodies tense. Then the flak begins. Sharp black puffs blooming outside the windows, the harsh crack of shrapnel against air, and the sudden metallic pinging that makes every man flinch. Because even if the Whitley isn't hit, a burst can scatter the stick across the countryside and turn a precise raid into a lonely man's war. Frost leans close to a paratrooper and shouts a last instruction, short, clipped, like a drill on a windy parade ground, while Cox adjusts his helmet and swallows hard, knowing that if he's captured with radar knowledge, his uniform won't protect him from what the Germans will do. The jumpmaster moves down the line, checking hooks, slapping shoulders, eyes hard in the dim light. Somewhere forward, the pilot fights the turbulence and the threat of enemy fire, trying to place them on the drop zone that aerial photos and resistance intelligence have made famous in the planning rooms. The red light above the door glows like a warning. The men sway with the aircraft's motion, each one feeling the weight of his weapon, Lee Enfield rifles, Sten guns, Bren guns, tools meant to solve problems quickly because speed is the only armor tonight. Then the green light snaps on. Wind howls through the open door like the sea itself has found them in the sky. Frost's last look down the line catches something he'll remember for the rest of his life. Not bravado, but focus. Tight faces, clenched jaws, men stepping into nothing because the mission demands it. One after another, they vanish into the moonlit black, falling toward snow-covered fields around Bruneval, toward the radar dish on the cliffs, toward the villa, toward the beach they must hold long enough for the Navy to appear out of the darkness. The men who vanish from the Whitley don't fall into a neat formation. They fall into France, and France answers with cold air, hard ground, and the distant, indifferent bark of a dog that doesn't know history is landing in its field. Parachutes blossom white under the full moon and then collapse into the snow like ghosts, and for a few seconds each paratrooper is alone with the sound of his own breathing and the scrape of webbing as he frees himself, yanking lines, stuffing silk, checking his weapon by touch, because you don't click metal in enemy territory unless you want the night to reply. Around Bruneval, the fields are pale and stiff, hedgerows black as ink, and when the first men find each other by whispered password and the shape of helmets, relief is quick but shallow, because the real fear in an airborne drop is not the Germans, it's dispersion, a unit scattered into fragments that can be hunted one by one. Frost's training holds them together. He moves like a man with a compass in his bones, gathering his company in the shadow of a hedgerow, while containers thump into the snow nearby, some landing perfectly, others vanishing into the dark like swallowed ammunition. A runner appears, breath steaming, reporting what no commander wants to hear on a timed raid. Half of the Nelson group, the men meant to secure the beach defenses for extraction, have come down miles short, lost in the countryside, and Frost feels the mission tighten around his throat because the plan is built on minutes. The radar strike, the withdrawal, the dash to the sand, the Navy appearing at dawn like a miracle. He does what good commanders do when the plan fractures. He assigns tasks, not panic. C Company is split into 5 detachments with names that sound oddly calm in the cold. Nelson, Jellicoe, Hardy, Drake, Rodney, and now those names become lifelines, shouted in whispers, repeated to keep men oriented as they start moving in file through the hedgerows toward the clifftop installation. Ahead lies the target, a Luftwaffe Würzburg radar site tied to a villa near the cliff edge, with guard posts and a garrison enclosure close by. Too close for comfort. Close enough that you imagine a sentry's cigarette ember as a beacon. Frost's men move fast but controlled. Sten guns hug tight. Bren teams careful with their weight, boots crunching snow that sounds too loud in the stillness. Then Cox appears in the middle of it all. Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Cox, the radar specialist, carrying the burden of why they came. He must identify the Würzburg set, photograph it, and help strip the crucial parts under fire if necessary. Because a radar machine isn't captured like a flag, it's captured by tearing out its brain and running with it. A small party of Royal Engineers keeps close, grim-faced tools and explosives prepared, knowing they may have only minutes at the dish before the Germans react or destroy the equipment. Somewhere in the distance, a burst of small arms fire crackles, too far to be decisive, close enough to remind everyone they're not invisible. And Frost pauses just long enough to listen, then drives them forward again toward the villa and the antenna beyond it, because every second spent listening is a second stolen from the tide schedule waiting down on the beach. Frost brings the scattered pieces of C Company forward like a clenched fist, tightening the formation as the hedgerows give way to open ground sloping toward the clifftop, and then the target reveals itself under the moon. The Würzburg radar dish, an eerie industrial silhouette in a shallow pit, sitting behind a villa that looks almost peaceful if you ignore the wire, the sentry posts, and the fact that every window could hide a rifle barrel. The assault groups melt into position with practiced economy, Jellicoe and Hardy edging in to take the radar and the villa, Drake watching the approach lines toward nearby buildings, Rodney held ready to block a counterattack from inland, while the understrength Nelson is still somewhere out there, fighting time itself to reach the beach defenses. Frost crouches behind cover, listens to the stillness, and feels the plan balancing on a razor, because stealth is already dying. The only question is whether they can kill it on their own terms. He raises a hand, and in that brief pause you can hear the wind off the channel and the faint metallic creak of equipment as men grip their weapons tighter. Then the order snaps through the dark like a whip. Go. Grenades arc into the villa's shadowed edge, followed instantly by bursts of automatic fire, the Stens coughing short and violent in the night, and the calm countryside shatters into echoes, bouncing off the cliffs. A German guard appears in an upstairs window, firing blindly into the muzzle flashes, and is cut down before he can do more than make the raid real. 2 more defenders are overwhelmed in the confusion and dragged out, prisoners, wide-eyed, shoved against a wall and interrogated in urgent whispers. What they reveal is both good news and a warning. The bulk of the garrison isn't in the villa, it's further inland, meaning the immediate resistance is lighter than feared, but any delay will give the Germans time to flood the area with reinforcements. Frost doesn't let the men linger. He pushes them toward the dish because the Würzburg is the reason they jumped. Then the enclosure buildings near the villa come alive, firing opening up in a hard, sudden line, and one of Frost's paratroopers goes down, hit cleanly, proof that the Germans are awake now and the clock is shrinking by the second. Frost tries to get word out, tries to coordinate, and discovers the nightmare. The radio sets aren't working. No clear link to Nelson on the beach, no way to confirm the extraction is ready. No reassurance that the escape route is even open. For a raid built on timing, silence is its own enemy. And right then, as the firing thickens and muzzle flashes wink from multiple directions, Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Cox and the Royal Engineers finally arrive at the radar pit, tools in hand, faces tight with focus. Cox doesn't waste a heartbeat admiring the machine. He identifies it like a surgeon finding the organ he needs, orders light on the panels, photographs what he can, and then starts tearing out the brain of the set. Key boxes, components, anything portable that can tell Britain how this radar sees. Engineers wrench and pry with a desperation that feels obscene under gunfire, electronics ripped free while bullets snap overhead, and the parts are loaded onto small trolleys designed for exactly this purpose. Metal wheels whispering in the grass as if the raid is trying to stay quiet out of habit. Frost watches the dark tree line and sees movement, vehicles, shapes, the suggestion of men coming fast. And he knows the window is closing. The Würzburg is coming with them, but now they must drag it through enemy fire, down toward the sea, and trust that the Navy will be waiting in the black water below. Frost doesn't give the Germans the dignity of a slow reaction. He knows the real danger is the minutes that follow the first shots, when an alarm spreads and the countryside starts to move. So the moment Cox confirms he has the key Würzburg components, the order turns from assault to escape. And escape is suddenly heavier than any weapon because it's made of metal boxes and fragile, irreplaceable knowledge. Men heave the stripped radar parts onto improvised carrying frames and small trolleys, hands slipping in wet grass, while others form a moving shield. Stens and Brenz pointed outward, because the withdrawal will be the most vulnerable moment of the night. Ahead, the route drops toward the cove at Bruneval, but the understrength Nelson group, the beach party meant to secure the extraction point, has run into exactly the kind of obstacle that turns plans into blood. Defensive positions near the exit routes, including a concrete machine gun post that rakes the approaches and pins men flat in the cold grass. Frost hears the steady, ugly hammer of it long before he sees it, and then another sound joins it, rifles and automatic fire from behind, from the direction of the villa, because the Germans have done what defenders do when surprised. They've reoccupied the strong point and are now firing into the British withdrawal line, trying to cut the raiders in two. The radio silence becomes a choking weight. No clean coordination, no reassurance from the beach, no simple way to tell the Navy, "We're coming." So Frost makes a decision with the brutal clarity of a commander who understands that every second spent sorting it out is a second the Germans use to build a net. He reinforces the beach fight with his reserve, Rodney, then wheels back with elements of Hardy, Jellicoe, and Drake to hit the villa again, because if that position keeps shooting into their backs, the raid dies on a French hillside with the radar parts scattered like scrap. The second attack is faster and dirtier than the first. Grenades, short bursts, men moving by instinct through doorways and shadows. And it works. The villa is cleared, the firing slackens, and suddenly the escape route is no longer a corridor of death. But the beach is still a problem. The machine gun post must be suppressed, flanked, or silenced. And Frost pushes men forward in rushes, using hedgerows and folds in the ground. Bren gunners laying down fire while others crawl close enough to throw grenades into the concrete throat. The Würzburg parts keep moving, carried like a wounded comrade that cannot be left behind. And when the path finally opens, the whole force surges toward the cliff descent in a mass of breathing men and clattering equipment. The drop to the shingle and sand is treacherous, ropes scrambling hands, boots sliding, the sea wind whipping at helmets, and down below the channel waits like a dark, impatient ally. Somewhere offshore, Royal Navy motorcraft are hunting the coastline, trying not to be seen by German patrols, listening for the one signal that will tell them the raid has survived. Frost's men hit the beach in disorder and reform by sheer will, forming a tight perimeter while eyes search the black water. Then a flare tears upward into the night, bright, unmistakable, desperate, and for a moment the entire raid hangs on whether the Navy can see it and whether the Germans can stop them before the boat's silhouettes appear out of the dark. The flare hangs for a heartbeat like a white-hot accusation, lighting the shingle and surf and every moving helmet on the sand, and instantly the Germans answer from above, the crack of rifles, the ugly stitching of a machine gun, rounds snapping into the beach with little explosions of sand that make men instinctively hunch lower around the precious radar boxes. Frost is down there now with the weight of the whole raid pressing on his shoulders, shouting orders that the wind tries to steal, forcing his company into a tight, defensive arc at the waterline while the tide breathes in and out as if it can't decide whether to help them or drown them. Somewhere up on the slope, Company Sergeant Major Jerry Strahan is carried and dragged into cover, wounded badly enough that his face is chalk, and men glance at him with that hard, guilty look soldiers get when they cannot stop for the injured. The Würzburg components, metal boxes and panels that look absurdly ordinary, are clutched like sacred objects, because those boxes are the purpose of the night and the reason the enemy fire feels personal. Out at sea, the channel is black and restless, and then, finally, you see it. Low silhouettes moving toward shore, almost invisible until a wave breaks pale against a bow. Landing craft edging in with engines throttled low, and behind them, faster shapes lurking farther out. Motor gunboats and motor launches ready to snatch the raiders away the instant they can be loaded. The first landing craft grinds its keel into the shallows with a harsh scrape, ramp dropping, and a handful of Royal Navy men and commandos spill forward into the surf to cover the embarkation. Rifles up, boots sinking in wet sand. For a second, it becomes a knife fight between coastline and sea. Bullets from the cliffs and muzzle flashes from the beach. Men wading chest deep to steady the craft as another wave tries to swing it sideways. Frost doesn't allow a crush. He forces order, pushing prisoners and wounded first, then the radar parts, then the men by detachments, because panic is how you lose the mission at the last yard. Cox is shoved aboard with his tool bag and his breath coming hard, and he looks down at the salvaged components as if he can't quite believe they are real, that he has literally torn them out of a German radar set under fire and lived. A German round slams into the water beside the ramp, sending a spray that tastes like metal, and someone curses, someone fires back, and then a Bren gun chatters in short controlled bursts to keep heads down on the cliff. The landing craft backs off, engines roaring, and the surf tries one last time to hold them. Men straining, arms and backs burning, pulling the final paratroopers aboard as the ramp clatters up. The beach recedes in the darkness, still alive with sporadic fire, still trying to reach them, but the sea is taking them now. Out beyond the breakers, the landing craft pulls alongside a motor gunboat, lines thrown, hands grabbing, and the raiders are transferred in a wet, dangerous scramble. Radar parts pass like ammunition across heaving decks, while the MGB's engines throb with impatience. For a moment, Frost stands on the gunboat's deck and looks back toward the French coast, toward the cliff and the villa and the dish they have wounded and robbed. And he knows the raid is not truly over until the white line of England appears again. The MGB turns, bows lifting, and slips into the night at speed, hunting the shadowed lanes through the channel, while somewhere nearby a German naval patrol prowls blindly, close enough that men stop breathing when a distant engine note changes, close enough that the stolen radar feels heavier in the hands simply because it exists. The motor gunboat's wake is a pale scar in the black water, and the men on deck huddle low behind the gun shield, and the boat's small superstructure as if posture alone can make them harder to see. The channel wind knifes through wet battle dress, salt-stinging cheeks already raw from cold and smoke, and every time the engine note changes, even slightly, heads turn toward the darkness, listening for the wrong sound. Another craft closing, an aircraft overhead, a German patrol that has guessed their line of escape. Frost moves among his paratroopers with the same clipped control he used on the cliff top, checking numbers, checking faces, making sure the wounded are still breathing, because extraction isn't a finish line. It's a vulnerable crossing where one lucky enemy contact can turn victory into wreckage. Nearby, Flight Sergeant Cox sits with the captured Würzburg components jammed between his boots and a bulkhead, his hands still trembling with delayed adrenaline as he rechecks what they carried out. Boxes and panels that look like ordinary machinery until you remember they were seeing British aircraft over France. A sailor drapes a tarpaulin over the pile as if hiding it will keep it safe from fate, and another man jokes in a thin voice that the Germans will be furious to find their eyes gone when morning comes. The joke dies quickly because nobody wants to imagine the German response. Search parties sweeping fields, interrogations in nearby villages, the angry logic of occupation. And you can feel the men's relief twisted with guilt. A special operations aftertaste that arrives once the shooting fades. You got out, but others will pay for the disturbance. The coastline of France shrinks behind them into a darker line beneath the sky. And then there is only sea, the slap of waves, and the mechanical heartbeat of engines pushing hard toward home. As the hours pass, the cold becomes its own enemy. Men stamp their feet, flex fingers around weapons, share cigarettes that taste like ash, and keep one eye on the horizon, where the first hint of dawn threatens to outline them for any lurking observer. When England finally appears as a low, grey promise, cliffs and lights masked, harbour shapes emerging, the boat doesn't slow its urgency. Lines are thrown, hands reach out, and the raiders spill onto the quay in a mess of wet boots and controlled exhaustion, met not by cheering crowds, but by officers with hard eyes and coats buttoned to the chin. The radar parts are taken first, immediately, as if the machinery outranks the men who carried it. Crates appear as if summoned, labels are slapped on, and the whole bundle is moved under guard toward waiting vehicles, because the real battlefield now is a laboratory and an intelligence briefing room where every screw and circuit might answer the question that has haunted Fighter Command since 1940. How does German radar find you, and how do you blind it? Frost's men are counted, questioned, photographed, then shepherded into a debrief that feels surreal after gunfire. The same voices that shouted into wind now speaking quietly under lamplight, mapping positions on paper, naming moments, describing the villa, the dish, the descent, the beach, the boats. Cox is pulled aside by specialists who treat him like a man carrying fire in his hands. He begins talking immediately, pointing, sketching, explaining what he saw and what he ripped out, because speed matters even now. Before the Germans can change procedures, before they can alter components, before the advantage fades. Outside, morning settles over England like a heavy blanket, and somewhere in France, the Bruneval site is waking to the damage. Here, in a guarded room with the stolen parts laid out on a table, the raid's impossible truth becomes visible in plain daylight. They jumped in, tore out the enemy's technology, and escaped by sea. In a secure room that smells of damp wool and cigarette smoke, the Würzburg components are laid out like organs on a surgical table. Metal boxes, wiring harnesses, panels with knobs and connectors, handled with a care that borders on reverence, because Britain's scientists and signals experts know they are staring at more than hardware. They are staring at the logic of a system that has been directing German night fighters an early warning, a machine that has been extending the enemy's reach across sky and sea. Cox stands over the parts with the strained intensity of a man who has carried his answer through gunfire, pointing out what matters and what doesn't, identifying key units, describing where each piece sat in the dish installation, how the Germans had mounted and protected them, what markings he saw in the dim light while bullets cracked overhead. Technical officers take notes in tight handwriting, their questions precise: frequencies, waveguides, calibration, the set's physical layout, how quickly it could be dismantled, how the garrison was arranged around it, what communications lines led from the pit to the villa and beyond. Everything about the raid becomes data now, because in war, intelligence is a weapon that gets sharpened by details. Frost, in a separate briefing, delivers the soldiers' version of the same story: how the assault unfolded, where resistance came from, how the villa had to be hit twice, how the beach defenses were more dangerous than expected, how radios failed, and decisions were made by instinct and training rather than clean coordination. His voice is steady, but his eyes reveal the exhaustion of a man who has watched a plan almost unravel in real time and held it together with shouted orders. In the days that follow, the stolen parts move quickly through Britain's wartime brain, passed to experts who can reverse engineer the set's capabilities, compared against British radar knowledge, and used to refine countermeasures, jamming techniques, deceptive signals, tactical changes in flight patterns that can make German radar less reliable, less confident, less deadly. The morale value is immediate as well, and you can feel it in the way senior officers talk about Bruneval in corridors. It is not just a raid, it is proof that Britain can reach into occupied Europe, strike a guarded installation, and return with the enemy's secrets in hand. It is a story meant for newspapers and for Allied ears. A message that the war is not only endured, but contested on the enemy's turf. Yet beneath that triumph, the men who jumped feel a quieter truth, the raid's cost in wounded and the narrow margins of survival. In their barracks, they replay moments in half sentences, remembering the flare over the beach and the taste of salt water and cordite, the sense that they were one misstep from being pinned on the sand with the radar parts scattered beyond recovery. Cox, now surrounded by scientists rather than gunfire, watches them test and probe the captured equipment and feels the strangest kind of disbelief, that something so dangerous and dramatic has turned into a collection of measured readings and careful diagrams. But that is the point. Special operations exist to turn action into advantage, to transform a midnight assault into daylight knowledge. And as the British begin shaping new tactics and countermeasures from what Bruneval provided, the Germans, across the Channel, begin their own grim review, reinforcing sites, changing security, hunting for answers, because the raid did not just steal metal, it forced the enemy to doubt the safety of every radar dish standing on every cliff. Across the Channel, daylight exposes what the moon hid, and the Bruneval site looks less like a fortress and more like a violated workshop. Guards staring at the empty spaces where critical Würzburg components had been, boot prints in churned grass, broken glass in the villa, the smell of smoke still trapped in corners. A German officer arrives with that tight, furious efficiency the Wehrmacht reserves for embarrassment, demanding reports, counting men, tracing the British route backward from the cliff to the fields where parachutes had fallen. And the questions come like hammer blows. How did they get in? Who failed to fire the alarm sooner? Why wasn't the equipment destroyed before it could be taken? Men who survived the night answer in fragments, ashamed of how quickly violence arrived, how grenades and Sten gun bursts shattered the illusion of control, how the attackers seemed to know exactly where to go. In nearby villages, occupation authorities start looking for proof of assistance. Eyes on locals, interrogations sharp with suspicion. Because German logic cannot accept that a raid this precise might happen without help. Even if the truth is more humiliating. The British planned well, moved fast, and exploited the thin gap between routine security and wartime surprise. Then the defensive reaction begins, and it spreads along the coast like a fever. More sentries, heavier patrols, stricter access, stronger wire, procedures drilled until they become reflex, especially at radar stations, because now every dish on every cliff has a shadow hanging over it, the fear that paratroopers could drop again with tools and explosives and disappear back into the sea. If you were a Luftwaffe radar crewman on the Channel coast, the night suddenly becomes louder, not because of enemy aircraft, but because every rustle in the hedgerow feels like boots. Back in Britain, the raid becomes a story told with deliberate purpose, a morale message that the enemy can be reached, that German technology can be stolen, that initiative still exists in a war that often feels like siege and endurance. The newspapers and briefings turn Bruneval into a symbol, and even men who weren't there feel the lift of it, the sense that special operations can strike beyond the front lines and return with more than prisoners. Inside the command structure, the lessons are studied with ruthless honesty. radios failing in the field, the necessity of clear fallback plans, the danger of beach exits under fire, the value of rehearsals and specialized roles like coxers, the importance of naval extraction timing and coordination. Combined operations officers and airborne planners dissect each minute, not to celebrate it, but to repeat it better next time. Frost's reputation hardens into something commanders can use, proof that airborne troops can hit, seize, withdraw, and hold nerve under confusion. And that proof will matter later when larger drops, bigger raids, and far more dangerous missions demand leaders who have already seen the plan crack and still carried it through. Yet for the men of C Company, the memory is less strategic and more visceral. The cold snap of February air, the white flare over the surf, the clatter of metal boxes passed hand to hand, the moment the boat's engines rose and the coastline fell away. The disbelief isn't that they fought. It's that they stole the enemy's eyes, walked out under fire, and turned a single night into an advantage that could ripple through the skies over Europe. In the weeks after Bruneval, the raiders returned to routines that feel strangely quiet: weapon cleaning, inspections, training jumps. Yet the night refuses to leave them, because once you've crossed into occupied Europe and come back, the world divides into before and after. And even a barracks corridor sounds different when you know how quickly silence can turn into gunfire. C Company's men become, in a small but real way, veterans, and the army notices the change in their posture: less talk, more focus, a calm that isn't comfort, but readiness. Frost is called in for more briefings than he ever expected, his answers requested by officers who already know the facts, but want to hear them from the man who made the decisions when the radios failed and the villa had to be taken twice. He speaks plainly, without romance, about timing, about dispersal, about the machine gun post on the beach, about the way a simple snag can expand into disaster when you're operating on minutes. Cox, meanwhile, becomes a different kind of soldier, treated like a man who survived a deep-sea dive with pearls in his pocket. He is questioned and re-questioned, not because anyone doubts him, but because his memory is a tool now, a map of the Würzburg set and its environment, and the scientist's work gains sharpness from his on-the-ground details. For the rank-and-file paratroopers, recognition arrives in fragments: a citation, a handshake, a mention in a communique. But the deeper reward is private: the knowledge that, for one night, they were the moving edge of the war, not simply absorbing blows but dealing them. Yet even in Britain's celebration, there is an unspoken weight. The raid succeeded partly because it was small and precise. Scaling that kind of operation will magnify every hazard: dispersion, communications breakdown, mistimed extraction, and those hazards don't forgive optimism. The planners of future raids study Bruneval the way surgeons study a successful but difficult operation. They note what worked, but they also note how close the patient came to dying on the table. And the men who jumped know it too. In their conversations, the heroism is stripped away, replaced by practical recollection: how cold the drop felt, how loud the snow crunch sounded, how the villa's rooms smelled of smoke and furniture polish, how heavy the radar parts were, how the flare made them feel naked on the beach. In the strategic war, the result echoes outward. Britain's understanding of German radar improves, countermeasures evolve, and the enemy is forced to adjust security and procedures along the coast, burning time and resources to protect installations that now feel vulnerable. Bruneval becomes one of those rare operations that produces both technical gain and psychological effect, and that combination is why it is remembered. But the most important impact is perhaps the simplest. It proves to Britain, and to the new airborne forces, that a unit of paratroopers can strike with speed, seize a specific objective, and withdraw under pressure, a template that will later expand into far larger operations where the margin for error is thinner and the consequences far greater. For C Company, the night becomes a shared reference point, a story that binds them tightly as they train for what comes next. And for Frost, it becomes the first hard marker on a path that will lead him again into darkness and gunfire. Because the war has a way of reusing the men who have proven they can keep moving when the plan breaks. By the time the paperwork is filed, and the scientists have extracted what they can from the stolen Würzburg components, Bruneval has already become more than a raid. It has become a lesson written in salt water and moonlight, a demonstration that modern war can be won not only by armies clashing, but by a few dozen men moving fast with a specific purpose and the nerve to trust a plan that ends on an exposed beach. In the halls of combined operations, officers talk about Operation Biting with the kind of restrained pride that avoids superstition, because the success was real, but the margin was razor thin. A dispersed drop nearly unbalanced the beach plan. Radios failed at the worst moment, and a single machine gun position threatened to turn extraction into slaughter. And yet the raid also proved the value of precise intelligence, rehearsals, specialized roles like Cox's technical expertise, and the partnership between airborne troops and naval forces that could appear out of darkness and vanish again. Along the Channel coast, the Germans respond exactly as the raid was meant to force them to respond, tightening security, shifting procedures, spending manpower to guard technology that had previously sat behind routine defenses, and in doing so they admit, in their own way, that the coastline is not a wall, but a vulnerable edge. In Britain's wider war story, Bruneval lands as an early morale injection in a period still heavy with uncertainty, a signal that initiative exists, that the enemy can be surprised and robbed, that Britain can do more than endure. But the deepest legacy sits in the minds of the men who were there, because they carry forward a memory that isn't propaganda at all. The sensation of stepping into the night over France, the hard thud of landing in snow, the crack of grenades at the villa, the absurdity of ripping electronics from a radar set while bullets snapped overhead, the relief and terror of waiting on a beach with the sea as your only exit, and then the sudden salvation of boats sliding out of darkness. If you want to understand why British paratroopers couldn't believe they stole Hitler's radar and escaped by sea, it's because the raid compressed impossible things into a single night. Airborne assault, technical theft, close quarters fighting, and naval extraction, each step capable of failure, each step survived by discipline and speed. And long after February 1942, the ripple continues. Planners remember Bruneval when they ask airborne forces to do bigger, riskier work. Scientists remember it when countermeasures blunt the enemy's detection. And the Germans remember it whenever a radar crew looks out at the dark sea and wonders whether the next shadow on the horizon is only a wave or the beginning of another raid.